The Grand Hall of the Accord was a cathedral of silence, built to amplify the scratch of a quill on parchment. Its obsidian walls drank the light from the 1,000 candles floating near the vaulted ceiling, and the air, cold and still, smelled of ancient stone and melted wax. King Adrian sat at the head of a monstrously long marble table, the treaty of the Silver Truce spread before him like a pale, dead thing. The weight of his crown was a familiar ache at his temples, a cold circle of gold and responsibility he had borne for 3 centuries. He was the architect of this peace, a peace bought with blood and strategy, and now, to be sealed with something far more precious. He kept his eyes on the document, on the elegant, merciless script that outlined the cessation of a 100-year war. Every line was a concession, every clause a victory. His kingdom would be safe. His people would no longer live in the shadow of the Slayer's pyre. This was the logical, necessary conclusion. The king had made his choice. Across the table, the Grand Master of the Slayers, a man named Theron, watched him with eyes like chips of flint. His face was a roadmap of old scars, his presence a palpable weight of conviction. He and his 5 lieutenants wore the grey and silver of their order, their armor scoured clean, their hands resting near the hilts of their blessed blades. They were anathema, a holy blight upon his world, and today, they were his partners in peace. The treaty required a gesture of faith, a hostage of such value that neither side would dare break the terms. The Slayers had demanded a royal. Adrian had no siblings, no children. He had only a wife. He could feel her presence behind him, standing near the great doors. He did not need to look. He could feel the warmth of her life, a small, defiant sun in this cold, dead place. Elena. A human woman he had married for political advantage, a union to appease the border lords who still traded with mortal settlements. She was supposed to have been a symbol, a pretty, pliable queen who would soften his image. He had treated her with a careful, calculated distance, offering courtesy but not confidence, comfort but not vulnerability. He was a king, and a king's heart was a political liability. He had believed that. He had built his reign on that belief. The final signatory clause, Theron said, his voice a low gravelly sound that scraped the silence. The offering. Adrian dipped the quill into the ink pot. The ink was a deep, viscous black, the color of a starless night. He could hear the faint rustle of Elena's dress, a soft whisper of velvet against the marble floor. He had told her it was a formality, a temporary arrangement. A lie. The treaty was clear. She would be taken into the Slayers' custody at their mountain fortress of Skyreath, to remain there as a permanent ward, a living symbol of the truce. A gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. He had assured himself she would be safe. They would not harm the linchpin of their new peace. It was a cold, hard calculation. A queen for a kingdom. A life for thousands. The math was simple. It was correct. He moved the quill to the parchment. His hand was perfectly steady. He was King Adrian, the unifier, the strategist. He did not feel. He ruled. But as the nib touched the page, he heard her take a single, sharp breath. And in that sound, the entire, magnificent edifice of his logic began to fracture. He looked up, his eyes finding hers across the vast, echoing hall. She stood between 2 of his royal guards, her posture regal, her chin high. She wore the deep blue gown she had worn for their first public appearance, the color of a twilight sky. Her dark hair was coiled in an intricate braid, a style his courtiers had called severe, but on her, it looked like a crown. He had expected to see fear in her eyes, or pleading. He saw neither. He saw a profound, terrifying clarity. She knew. In that moment, she understood the totality of his betrayal, the lie he had built between them, and the truth of what was about to happen. Her face was pale, but her expression was one of quiet, devastating appraisal. She was not looking at her king. She was looking at the man who had just sold her. The image seared itself behind his eyes, the slight parting of her lips, the way the pulse in her throat beat a frantic, fragile rhythm, the utter stillness of her gaze. There was no accusation in it, only a deep, wounded knowledge. And in that knowledge, Adrian saw everything he was about to lose. Not a political asset. Not a symbolic queen. The woman who left wildflowers on his desk because the room smelled of dust and old paper. The woman whose quiet laughter in the library was the only sound that could soothe the ceaseless hum of politics in his head. The woman who looked at him, sometimes, not as a monarch of terrible power, but as a man who seemed impossibly lonely. He felt a sudden, violent urge to roar, to splinter the marble table with one blow, to tear the treaty to shreds and slaughter the men who had dared to ask this of him. The king was forgotten, and in his place was a raw, primal thing that wanted to burn the world to keep her safe. But the moment passed. Centuries of discipline slammed back into place. The quill in his hand completed his name. The ink bled into the fibers of the parchment, a final, irrevocable stain. Theron gave a curt nod. Two of his slayers detached from the wall and began the long walk toward Olenna. Their armored boots echoed in the hall, each footstep a hammer blow against Adrian's ribs. Olenna did not flinch. She watched them approach, her gaze never leaving Adrian's. It was as if they were the only two people in the universe, locked in this final, silent exchange. He wanted to say her name, but the word was a stone in his throat. He wanted to rise, to go to her, but the crown held him down, a mountain of gold and duty. The slayers stopped on either side of her. They did not touch her. They waited. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acceptance that shattered what was left of his composure. She turned, her back to him now, a straight, proud line of blue velvet, and began to walk toward the great doors. The king's guards, his own men, stepped aside to let her pass. They would not meet his eyes. Adrian watched her go. He watched until the doors swung open, flooding the hall with the grey light of a dying afternoon. He watched as her silhouette was framed for a moment against the sky. And then the doors closed, a deep, booming sound of finality, and she was gone. The hall was silent again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer still and cold. It was empty. A vast, suffocating void where a small, defiant sun had just been extinguished. Theron rose, rolling the treaty with a practiced efficiency. "The truce holds, Your Majesty," he said. Adrian did not look at him. He was still staring at the doors, at the place where she had been. The victory was his. The kingdom was safe. He had won. But the only thing he could feel was the ghost of her eyes on him, and the chilling, absolute certainty that he had just made the single greatest mistake of his very long life. The king had saved his kingdom, but the man had lost his soul. The days that followed were a study in hollow triumph. Adrian moved through the motions of his reign with the seamless precision of an automaton. He received the adulation of his court, the grateful deference of the border lords, the tearful praise of common folk who no longer feared the midnight raid of a slayer crusade. Peace settled over the land like a fresh, clean shroud. The war was over. His name was etched into history as a savior, a visionary. And every night, he returned to the royal apartments to be devoured by a silence so complete it had a physical presence. He would stand in the doorway of her chambers, which he had ordered left untouched. Everything was as she had left it. A book of mortal poetry lay open on her bedside table, a slender ribbon marking her place. A half-empty glass of water. A velvet shawl draped over the back of a chair, still holding the faint, ghostly scent of her skin, lavender and something else, something uniquely her, something warm and alive. He would reach out to touch the fabric, his long fingers hesitating just above the threads, terrified that the contact would dissolve the last lingering trace of her. These rooms, once a part of the palace he barely noticed, had become a mausoleum of his regret. He had sacrificed her for this kingdom, and now the entire kingdom felt like a tomb. His council saw a king more focused, more decisive than ever. Lord Valerus, his oldest advisor, a vampire whose face was a mask of elegant wrinkles, praised his newfound clarity. "You are unburdened, my king," he'd said one evening, as they reviewed trade manifests. A difficult choice, but the correct one. "The kingdom thrives," Adrian had simply nodded, the words turning to ash in his mind. Unburdened. He had never been heavier. He carried her absence with him everywhere. It was in the taste of the wine he drank, in the cool silk of his sheets, in the echo of his own footsteps in the long, empty corridors. He began to see her everywhere. A glimpse of dark hair in a crowd would make his dead heart lurch. The sound of a woman's quiet laughter from a distant balcony would make him stop, frozen, straining to hear it again. He was haunted, not by a ghost, but by a memory so vivid it felt more real than the world around him. The memory of her face in the grand hall of the Accord. The clarity in her eyes. The knowledge. He replayed that moment endlessly, dissecting it, torturing himself with it. He had seen love there, he realized now, with the brutal clarity of hindsight. Not the fiery, possessive passion of his kind, but something quieter, deeper. A steady, patient affection she had offered him, and which he, in his kingly arrogance, had failed to even recognize, let alone return. He had been so focused on the crown, on the kingdom, on the grand tapestry of power, that he had missed the single, perfect thread that might have given it all meaning. He had not loved her then. He had not allowed himself the vulnerability. But in her absence, love grew like a poison vine, wrapping around his soul, squeezing the life from his immortal existence. It was a strange, agonizing alchemy. He had to lose her to understand what she was. And now he knew. He loved her. The admission was a physical blow, a truth so powerful it buckled his knees. He loved her, and he had handed her to his enemies. 3 months after the treaty, the first reports trickled in. Whispers from his spies embedded near the Slayer's mountain fortress. They were meant to be monitoring the truce, ensuring Theront's men held to the terms. But one report, buried deep within a routine communique, mentioned a new recruit among the Slayers. A woman. Human. Displaying a preternatural talent for tracking and combat. The report noted her ferocity, her cold, single-minded efficiency. The spy had not seen her face, which was often veiled, but had noted her name, the one given to her by the Order, Nemesis. The goddess of retribution. Adrian had dismissed it at first. A coincidence. But a seed of unease was planted. He dispatched his most trusted agent, a shadow flitter named Kale, with one directive: identify this recruit. Kale was gone for 6 weeks. He returned not to the throne room, but to Adrian's private study, long after midnight. He materialized from the shadows near the hearth, his form coalescing like smoke. He did not kneel. "My king," Kale whispered, his voice strained. He held out a small, rolled piece of parchment. It was not a formal report. It was a sketch. Adrian's hands trembled as he took it. He had not trembled in 200 years. He unrolled the parchment. It was a charcoal drawing, rough but rendered with a spy's attention to detail. A woman's face, framed by the stark cowl of a Slayer's hood. The lines of the face were harder, the mouth set in a grim, unyielding line. There were new scars, a thin white line that bisected her left eyebrow, another that traced the sharp angle of her jaw. But it was her. It was Elena. The eyes were the same, but the wounded knowledge he remembered was gone. In its place was a cold, empty fire. The look of a hunter. Beneath the sketch, Kale had written a single, devastating sentence. They did not cage her. They forged her into a weapon. The parchment slipped from Adrian's fingers. The world narrowed to a single point of sound, the frantic, useless beating of his own dead heart. She was alive. A surge of impossible, agonizing relief crashed through him, so powerful it was a physical pain. She was alive. And then the second wave hit, the undertow of Kale's words. A weapon. They had taken his wife, the woman who loved poetry and wildflowers, and they had turned her into one of them. A slayer. A killer of his kind. A low sound tore itself from his throat, something between a growl and a sob. The vast, intricate web of control he had maintained for 3 centuries didn't just fray, it vaporized. The king was gone. The strategist was gone. All that remained was the man, the monster, and the all-consuming, world-ending rage. He looked at Kale, his eyes blazing with a light the spy had never seen. "She hunts us," Adrian said, his voice a broken whisper. Kale nodded, his own face pale. "She is their best, my king. They call her the Queen of Ash. She leaves nothing but bodies and cinders in her wake." Adrian threw his head back and laughed, a terrible, broken sound that echoed off the stone walls of the study. The irony was so exquisite it was a form of torture. He had given them a hostage to ensure peace, and they had given him back a war, embodied in the one person he now knew he could not live without. The kingdom he had saved, the peace he had engineered, it was all meaningless ash in his mouth. He had made a choice, the cold, logical choice of a king. And now, he would make the choice of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose but the madness of his own grief. He would get her back. Or he would burn her new world, and his own, to the ground. The next morning, The court was convened for what they believed was a routine session on territorial tariffs. The lords and ladies of the vampire aristocracy stood in their customary places in the throne room, their silks and velvets a riot of dark jewel tones against the grey stone. They murmured amongst themselves, their ancient, predatory grace a mask for the petty squabbles and power plays that defined their existence. Lord Valerus stood at the foot of the throne, his expression placid, confident in the order his king had so recently, and so ruthlessly, established. They were all basking in the warmth of the new peace, a peace that felt solid, permanent. They had no idea the architect of that peace was about to demolish it. Adrian entered not from the royal passage behind the throne, but through the main doors, the same doors through which Elena had departed. He walked the length of the hall alone, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, expectant silence. He wore no crown. His black tunic was unadorned, his hair unbound. He looked less like a king and more like a man walking to his own execution. He ascended the dais but did not sit on the throne. He turned to face them, his eyes sweeping over the sea of confused and wary faces. For 300 years, he began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the cavernous room, I have served this kingdom. I have bled for it. I have schemed for it. I have sacrificed for it. His gaze found Valerus, and the old vampire flinched at the raw agony he saw there. 3 months ago, I made the greatest of those sacrifices. I traded my queen for your security. I gave Elena, a human woman who had done no wrong, to our sworn enemies to purchase a truce. A murmur rippled through the court. This was known, but never spoken of so baldly. It was the unpleasant calculation that had bought their current comfort. They had accepted it as the hard price of victory. I told myself it was the choice of a king, Adrian continued, his voice growing stronger, laced with a self-loathing so profound it was a tangible force. I told myself it was for the greater good. I told you all that it was a necessary price. I lied. The silence was now absolute, a ringing, breathless vacuum. There is no greater good that is built on the bedrock of such a betrayal. There is no kingdom worth the cost of a single, innocent soul. I chose power over a person. I chose a throne over a promise. And in doing so, I have failed not only as a man, but as your king. He took a deep breath, the words coming now like a torrent, a confession he had held back for months. The peace we enjoy is a poisoned fruit. It is a lie. And I will no longer be the king of a lie. He looked from face to face, seeing the dawning horror in their eyes. This was not the cold, calculating monarch they knew. This was a man on fire with regret, and he was threatening to set their entire world ablaze. I have received word of my wife, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound more menacing than any shout. The slayers did not honor the spirit of our accord. They did not keep her as a ward. They broke her. They remade her. They have turned her into a hunter of our kind. She lives, and she serves those who would see us all destroyed. Gasps echoed through the hall. Valerus took a half-step forward, his hand outstretched as if to ward off the words. My king, this is a complication. But the treaty holds. We can protest this through diplomacy. Adrian laughed, the same broken, terrible sound from the night before. The time for diplomacy is over. The time for treaties is over. He looked directly at his council, at the powerful, ancient vampires who had advised him for centuries. I am dissolving this council. I am suspending the Treaty of the Silver Truce. And I am here to inform you that I am abdicating the throne. Chaos erupted. Shouts of disbelief and fury crashed against the stone walls. Valerus stared, his mouth agape, his placid mask shattered. Abdicate? Adrian, you are mad. The kingdom will shatter. The slayers will see it as weakness. They will attack. Let them, Adrian snarled, his eyes flashing with crimson light. Let the kingdom shatter. Let it all burn. I sacrificed her to save it, and it was not worth the price. Now, I will sacrifice it to save her. It is the only atonement that has any meaning. He held up a hand, and the sheer force of his presence quelled the uproar. I renounce my crown. I renounce my titles. I renounce my duties. I have only one duty now, to find her. To beg for a forgiveness I do not deserve. To stand between her and the monsters who made her, and the monsters who let her be taken. His gaze swept the room, a final, damning indictment. I leave the kingdom in your hands. Do with it what you will. It is a thing of stone and borders. I am going to find my heart." Without another word, he turned his back on the throne, on his court, on his entire life's work. He descended the dais and walked back down the long aisle, the cacophony of his subjects' outrage rising behind him. They did not understand. They saw it as madness, as the ultimate dereliction of duty. They saw a king committing political suicide, throwing away centuries of stability for a human woman, for a memory. They were right. It was madness. It was suicide. And it was the first true, honest thing he had done in 100 years. He walked out of the throne room, out of the palace, leaving the shattered pieces of his kingdom behind him without a single backward glance. The king was dead. Adrian, the penitent, was all that was left. The world outside the palace walls was a harsh and unforgiving thing. Adrian had forgotten its texture, the grit of it. For centuries, his reality had been one of polished marble, soft velvet, and the rarefied air of power. Now, it was the suck of mud on his boots, the sting of freezing rain on his face, and the sour smell of fear in the taverns where he sought information. He traded his royal signet ring for a horse and a sword, his fine clothes for durable leather. He was no one now, just another grim-faced traveler on the road, and the anonymity was a strange comfort. It was a stripping away of the lies, leaving only the raw purpose that drove him. He hunted her as she hunted his kind. It was a grim pilgrimage, following the trail of her work. He found the aftermaths of her kills, vampire nests reduced to ash and rubble, the scent of sanctified steel still lingering in the air. The slayers were brutal and thorough, but her work had a different quality. It was surgical, precise. There was no wasted effort, no theatrical cruelty. It was the clean, cold work of an expert. He saw her efficiency and felt a pang of perverse pride, immediately followed by a wave of soul-crushing guilt. He had created this. His betrayal was the flint that had struck the spark of this terrible fire. He traveled for months, through the jagged peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains and into the sodden marshlands of the Weeping Fen. He spoke to humans in hushed tones, gathering whispers of the Queen of Ash, the silver-eyed slayer who moved like a ghost and never missed her mark. They spoke of her with a mixture of awe and terror. She was their avenging angel, a symbol of their defiance. To Adrian, every story was another twist of the knife. He learned her movements, her patterns. She worked alone, shunning the company of other slayers. She took the most dangerous assignments, the ones deep in vampire territory, as if she had a death wish. Or perhaps, he thought, as if she were searching for something. For him. The thought was both a hope and a terror. He finally caught up to her trail in the crumbling, northern province of Greywood, a land of perpetual twilight under a canopy of ancient, moss-draped trees. He found a village that had been terrorized by a small coterie of feral vampires. The villagers told him the Queen of Ash had passed through 2 days prior. The nest was now a smoking ruin on the edge of the woods. She was close. He tracked her from the village, his own ancient senses, long dulled by palace life, sharpening with every step. He could smell the faint trace of crushed herbs, a scent she had always favored, and the cold, metallic tang of slayer weaponry. The trail led him deep into the forest, to a place where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sky. It ended at a clearing, where a small, ruined chapel stood, its stone walls choked with ivy, its roof long since collapsed to the heavens. He paused at the edge of the clearing, his heart, for the first time, hammering with something other than guilt. It was fear. He was afraid of what he would find. Afraid of the woman she had become. Afraid that she would look at him and see nothing worth saving. He took a breath that did nothing to calm him and stepped into the open. She was there. She sat on the edge of a broken stone altar, sharpening a wicked-looking silver blade on a whetstone. The sound was a rhythmic, abrasive whisper in the quiet woods. She wore the slayer's uniform, hardened black leather, a grey surcoat, and a quiver of crossbow bolts slung across her back. Her dark hair was cut short, ruthlessly practical. She didn't look up, but the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel stopped. "I knew you were following me," she said. Her voice was different. The warmth was gone, replaced by a low, chilling flatness. "I could smell the rot of royalty for the last 50 miles. He stopped, a dozen paces from her, his hands open at his sides. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed 1,000 speeches filled with remorse and explanation. They all crumbled to dust in the face of her reality. She was more formidable, more beautiful, and more broken than he had ever imagined. "Elena," he said, and his own voice sounded strange, a hollow echo of the king he had been. She finally looked up, and his breath caught. The cold fire he had seen in the sketch was a pale imitation of the real thing. Her eyes were abysses of controlled hatred. She set the blade and whetstone aside with a deliberate, unhurried motion. Her hand went to the crossbow resting on the altar beside her. She picked it up, the movement fluid and economical. She cocked it, the click of the mechanism unnaturally loud in the silence, and leveled it at his chest. "Don't use that name," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "That woman is dead. You killed her." "I did," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I did, and I am sorry. It is a meaningless word, I know, but it is the only one I have." A flicker of something, surprise, contempt, crossed her face. "Sorry? You think sorry covers it? You stood there and watched them take me. You sold me, Adrian. Like a piece of property. For peace. For your precious kingdom. The kingdom can burn," he said, taking a half-step forward. The crossbow didn't waver. "I left it. I abdicated. It's nothing to me. Nothing is anything to me, but you." She laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound that held no humor. "Now? You decide that now? A little late for grand gestures, don't you think? Did your conscience finally become inconvenient?" "My conscience has been screaming every moment since you left," he said, his own voice raw with emotion. He stood perfectly still, the point of the crossbow bolt aimed directly at his heart. He knew it was silver-tipped, blessed, and would kill him as surely as the dawn. "I was a fool. A coward who hid behind a crown because he was afraid to feel anything. I didn't know what you were to me until I threw you away. I didn't know I loved you." The word hung in the air between them, obscene in its vulnerability. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the crossbow. Her whole body was rigid, a drawn bowstring of fury. "Love," she hissed. "You don't know the meaning of the word. Love isn't a negotiation. It isn't a political calculation. You don't trade it for something you want more." She took a steadying breath. "Get out of here, Adrian. Go back to your throne and your lies. There's nothing for you here." "I'm not leaving," he said softly. "You can kill me. You have every right. In fact, it might be the only justice left in this world." He looked down at the crossbow, then back into her eyes. "But I am not leaving you. Not again." He stood there, unmoving, a willing target. He was offering her the vengeance she deserved, making no move to defend himself, no attempt to use his power. This was the beginning of his grovel, not in words, but in action. He was laying his life at her feet, a pathetic, inadequate offering to atone for the life he had stolen from her. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The forest was silent, watching. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the war between the woman she had been and the weapon she had become. The hunter's instinct screamed at her to fire. But somewhere, deep beneath the layers of ice and rage, a flicker of something else, pain, confusion, memory, stayed her hand. The crossbow remained aimed at his heart, but for now, she did not shoot. The standoff in the ruined chapel became the new shape of their world. Elena did not lower the crossbow, and Adrian did not move. Twilight bled into the forest, the long, grey shadows of the trees stretching like skeletal fingers across the clearing. The air grew cold. Still, they remained, locked in a tableau of hatred and penance. Finally, with a curse that was more exhaustion than anger, she lowered the weapon. She didn't put it down, just let the tip dip toward the ground. "Your death is too easy a price," she said, her voice raspy. "You don't get to be a martyr. You get to live with what you've done." She turned her back on him, a gesture of dismissal more profound than any violence, and began to build a small fire in the nave of the chapel. Adrian took it as the barest sliver of an opening. He did not approach her. He retreated to the edge of the clearing and kept watch, a silent, sleepless guardian in the darkness. He was a king who had commanded armies, and now his entire world was reduced to this small circle of crumbling stone, his only purpose to watch over the woman who despised him. This was his penance. Days turned into weeks. She moved, and he followed, a persistent shadow she could not shake. She never spoke to him directly, never acknowledged his presence except with a glare of pure contempt if he came too close. But she didn't try to kill him, and she didn't try to lose him. It was a strange, unspoken truce. He was her prisoner, and her protector. He learned the rhythms of her new life. She was relentless, disciplined. She rose before dawn, trained for hours, her body a blur of motion with blades, staff, and bow, and hunted by night. He watched her from a distance, his heart a knot of pride and agony. He saw the cost of her new skills in the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones, in the way she sometimes flinched at sudden noises, in the nightmares that made her cry out in her sleep. He did not offer comfort. He knew she would reject it. Instead, he offered service. When her supply of arrows ran low, she would wake to find a new bundle of perfectly fletched bolts lying just outside her camp, their heads forged from the melted silver of his own royal cutlery, which he still carried in a small pouch. When a storm blew in, she would find he had constructed a crude but effective shelter against the driving rain while she had been away. He would hunt game and leave it cleaned and dressed for her, never taking any for himself. He grew gaunt, his fine-boned face becoming sharp and hollowed, but he never touched mortal food in her presence. He was starving himself, slowly, a quiet act of self-flagellation. He was proving his words were not empty. He had said her kingdom could burn, and he made it so. One evening, a rider found him, a loyalist from his old guard who had tracked him for months. The man, breathless and frantic, delivered the news. Lord Valerus had been deposed. A rival faction, led by a brutal old warlord named Malachi, had seized the capital. The truce with the Slayers was broken. The kingdom was descending into civil war. "They need you, my king," the guard pleaded. "You are the only one who can restore order." Elena was nearby, listening. This was the test. Adrian looked at the guard, his face an unreadable mask. He took the man's offered dispatch, a plea for his return from the remnants of his council. He didn't read it. He held it over Elena's small campfire until it caught, the parchment blackening and curling into ash. "Tell them," Adrian said to the stunned guard, his voice low and steady, "that the king is dead. There is only the man, and the man is not coming back." He dismissed the guard and turned to look at Elena. Her expression was guarded, but for the first time since he had found her, the pure, unadulterated hatred in her eyes had been diluted by something else. Confusion. Uncertainty. He had just thrown away his last chance to reclaim his power, his legacy, his entire world. He had done it without hesitation. For her. He had let his kingdom burn. She began to speak to him after that. Not with warmth, but with a grudging necessity. She would ask for his assessment of a tactical situation, for his knowledge of vampire weaknesses. She started to use him as the weapon he was, and he submitted to it gladly. He became her strategist, her scout, her living encyclopedia of the enemy. They were a team, a horrifyingly effective one, bound not by affection, but by a shared, bloody purpose. Slowly, tentatively, the ice around her began to thaw. One night, as they sat on opposite sides of a fire, she spoke without being prompted by a question of strategy. "Why did you marry me, Adrian?" The question was quiet, devoid of accusation. It was a genuine inquiry. He looked into the flames, the light flickering across his starved face. "For an alliance. To placate the border lords." It was a political maneuver he forced himself to meet her eyes. "It was the most foolishly pragmatic, short-sighted decision of my life. I saw a pawn, and I was blind to the queen." She was silent for a long time. "I used to watch you in the library," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You would read for hours. You thought no one was looking. You didn't look like a king then. You just looked tired." It was the first crack in her armor, the first hint of the woman he had known. He felt a surge of hope so fierce it was painful. He said. "I have been tired for a very long time." But their fragile, evolving peace was not destined to last. The Slayers did not appreciate their most prized weapon consorting with the enemy, even if that enemy was her personal quarry. They had been watching her. They saw her methods softening, saw her allowing one specific vampire to live. To them, she was compromised. Tainted. A tool that had become unreliable. And the Slayers had a simple, brutal way of dealing with unreliable tools. The trap was laid in a town called Haven's Crest, a place supposedly besieged by a powerful vampire elder. The Order sent word for Elena to rendezvous with a team of their elite warriors, the Silver Griffins. It was a lie. There was no elder. There was only the Griffins, and their orders were not to assist her, but to execute her. Adrian sensed it first. The air was wrong. The town was too quiet. "It's a trap, Elena," he warned, his senses screaming at him. She didn't want to believe it. The Order was her family now, the only thing she had left. "You're paranoid," she retorted, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "They wouldn't. I'm their best." "And you are consorting with a vampire," he countered gently. "To them, the infection has spread. You are a threat to their purity." They arrived at the designated meeting point, the town square, just as the sun was setting. The square was empty, save for 5 figures in the polished silver armor of the Griffins. Their leader, a grim-faced woman named Captain Iona, stepped forward. Her eyes were cold, her mouth a thin, merciless line. "Elena of the Ashes," Iona said, her voice ringing with formal authority. "By order of the Grand Master, you are charged with treason and consorting with the enemy. Your sentence is death." Elena stared at her, her face a mask of shocked disbelief. The betrayal was so blatant, so absolute, it stole the air from her lungs. She had given them everything, her grief, her rage, her life, and they were discarding her like a broken blade. She looked from their cold faces to Adrian's, and in his eyes, she saw not triumph, but a deep, shared sorrow. He had warned her. He knew what it was to be betrayed by the very institution you served. "You used me," Elena whispered, the words catching in her throat. "We forged you," Iona corrected coldly. "And now your service is at an end." She drew her blade, the silver gleaming in the fading light. The other 4 slayers followed suit, their swords making a soft, metallic hiss as they were unsheathed. They began to advance, forming a circle around her and Adrian. Elena reached for her own weapons, her body moving on pure instinct. But she was outnumbered, outmatched. Adrian stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. He was unarmed, gaunt, and weary, but he stood as if he were still clad in royal armor, a king defending his last and only territory. "You will not touch her," Adrian said, his voice a low growl that promised violence beyond their comprehension. Iona sneered. "You are a dead man, vampire. Stand aside and we might grant you a swift end." Adrian smiled, but it was a terrifying sight, a bearing of fangs that held no humor, only the promise of annihilation. "You mistake me for a politician," he said, his eyes beginning to glow with a faint, crimson light. "I am done with negotiations." In that moment, he was no longer the penitent, the groveling lover. He was the ancient predator he had suppressed for so long. He had let his kingdom fall, starved himself, humbled himself, all for her. But he would not let them take her. That was a line he would not allow to be crossed. This was the final choice, the one that transcended politics, penance, and reason. It was simple, primal, and absolute. Her, over everything else. The slayers charged. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and a symphony of violence. Adrian moved with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He was a wraith of black leather and righteous fury. The first slayer, a large, bearded man, swung his greatsword in a deadly arc Adrian didn't dodge. He flowed under the blow, his hand shooting out to grip the man's throat. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the slayer dropped, his armor clattering on the cobblestones. Elena watched, frozen for a heartbeat, stunned by the sheer, brutal efficiency of his power. This was the might he had held in check for months, the terrifying force that had conquered a continent. And he was unleashing it all for her. He took the second slayer's sword from his hand, the blessed silver burning his palm, but he didn't flinch. The metal sizzled, smoke rising from his skin, but his grip was iron. He spun, the stolen blade a silver whisper, and parried a thrust from Captain Iona. Their blades locked, screeching, inches from his face. "She is mine," Adrian roared, the sound inhuman, echoing with centuries of repressed power. He forced Iona back, his strength overwhelming her. He was not just fighting them, he was dismantling them. He moved through them like a storm. He broke a man's arm with a contemptuous twist, then drove the pommel of his stolen sword into another's helmet, the impact ringing like a death knell. He was a whirlwind of precise, lethal motion. It was not a fight, it was a massacre. He was showing them the difference between a trained soldier and an ancient, territorial predator defending its mate. Elena snapped out of her shock. She drew her own blades, her body moving with the deadly grace they had taught her. She was no one's damsel. She met the last griffin, a young man with panicked eyes, and their swords rang together. But her heart wasn't in it. She was fighting the men who had been her brothers in arms, the people who had given her a purpose when she had none. The fight ended quickly, her blade finding an opening in his defense, a wound to disable, not to kill. But Adrian was not dealing in half measures. He disarmed Iona, sending her sword spinning into the darkness. She stood before him, weaponless, her face pale with shock and fear. She had only ever seen vampires as monsters to be hunted, prey to be cornered. She had never faced one like this, a king fighting with the fury of a god. "It's over," Elena called out, her voice shaking. "Adrian, stop." He heard her. He looked at the terrified captain, his chest heaving, the crimson light in his eyes slowly fading back to their natural grey. The rage receded, leaving the weary, penitent man in its place. He tossed the silver sword aside, the metal clattering loudly in the sudden, ringing silence of the square. He turned to Elena, his hand smoking where the silver had burned him, his face a mask of concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice soft, the storm completely gone. She could only shake her head, staring at the carnage around them. He had slaughtered the elite of her order, the very people who had defined her life for the past year. He had chosen her, not just over his kingdom, but over the last semblance of peace in the world. He had declared war on the only power that could challenge him, all to save her. The surviving slayers, Iona and the man Elena had wounded, scrambled away into the darkness, leaving their dead behind. They were alone in the square, surrounded by the bodies of her former comrades. The scale of his choice, of his sacrifice, settled over her. He hadn't just said the words. He had shown her, in the most brutal, unequivocal way possible, that he would burn the entire world for her. She looked at him, at the gaunt face, the haunted eyes, the hand that was still blistering from the silver he had wielded to protect her. The last wall of ice around her heart didn't just crack, it shattered. The hatred, the rage, the need for vengeance that had driven her for so long, it all just evaporated. It left behind a deep, aching void, which was slowly, terrifyingly, being filled with something else. Something she thought had died in the grand hall of the Accord. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gently took his burned one. He flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. She traced the angry red welts left by the silver, her touch feather-light. "You chose me," she whispered, the words full of a wonder that felt like pain. "Always," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "From now on, always." The 2 years that followed were a quiet, fragile reconstruction. They did not return to his sundered kingdom, nor did they seek a new one. They became nomads, ghosts drifting through the quiet, forgotten corners of the world. The war between Malachi's faction and the Slayers raged on, a distant, bloody storm they had left behind. For Adrian and Elena, the only world that mattered was the one they built together, moment by patient moment. Trust did not come in a single, cathartic rush. It was earned in the small hours of the night, in 1,000 unspoken gestures. It was in the way he would wake from a nightmare of his own, not of war or death, but of the day he let her go, and she would place a calming hand on his arm until his breathing evened out. It was in the way she would clean and bandage his burned hand, the scars a permanent reminder of his choice, and he would let her, accepting the tenderness without flinching. He taught her the history of the stars, naming the constellations in the ancient vampire tongue. She taught him how to find north using the moss on the trees, a simple piece of mortal woodcraft that he, in all his centuries, had never known. They talked for hours, filling in the vast, silent spaces that had existed between them. She told him of her life in the Slayer's fortress, of the brutal training and the cold camaraderie. He told her of his own lonely childhood, of the crushing weight of a crown he never wanted, and the man he had forgotten how to be. They were learning each other, not as king and queen, but as two wounded people finding solace in one another's company. The power dynamic that had once defined them was gone. He was no longer her monarch, and she was no longer his subject, nor his enemy. They were simply Adrian and Elena. One evening, they sat by a lake so still it perfectly mirrored the star-dusted sky, making it seem as if they were floating in a void of light. It had been 2 years to the day since the massacre at Haven's Crest. "I forgive you, Adrian," she said, the words falling softly into the night air. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the starlight. He had been waiting to hear those words, hoping for them, but he had never asked. He knew they had to be given freely, or they meant nothing. He saw no hesitation in her eyes, only a quiet, settled peace. "Why?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "Because you didn't just apologize," she said, looking out at the water. "An apology is a word. You have spent 2 years building a new truth. You chose me when it was easy, in that square. But you have also chosen me every single morning since, when it has been quiet and hard, and there was no one to see. You chose me over your pride, over your power, over your past. The man who stands with me now is not the king who sold me." She turned to meet his gaze, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in years. "I think I am finally ready to meet him." He didn't have the words to respond. He simply reached for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of their entire journey, the betrayal, the atonement, the slow, painful healing. A month later, they stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, the wind whipping her short hair around her face. He wore simple black, she a simple dress of dark blue, the color of a twilight sky. There was no priest, no court, no audience. There was only the sky, the sea, and them. He held her hands, his grip warm and steady. "I had a kingdom," he said, his voice carrying over the sound of the waves. "It was made of stone and fear. I thought it was my life's work. I was wrong. My life's work is this." Learning the shape of your hand in mine, he slid a simple, unadorned silver ring onto her finger. It was one he had forged himself over a campfire, imperfect and a little rough, but made with his own 2 hands. "I vow to you, Elena, not as a king, but as a man. To choose you, every day. To be the home you deserve. To love you not as an idea, but as the woman you are. Always." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. She took the matching ring he had made for himself and slid it onto his finger. "I had a cause," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was made of vengeance and rage. I thought it was my only purpose. I was wrong. My purpose is this." Learning to see the man behind the monster, she squeezed his hand. "I vow to you, Adrian. To build a new life with you, not on the ashes of the past, but on the ground we stand on now. To be your partner, your friend, and your love. Always." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion or frantic relief. It was a quiet, certain thing, a seal on a promise that had already been kept 1,000 times over. It was the beginning of a new normal, a peace they had earned not through treaties or swords, but through the difficult, courageous work of forgiveness. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun set over the endless ocean, 2 solitary figures against the vastness of the world, finally, and completely, home.